Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works. All right, well, her new collection of poems, Scientific Marvel, out through Anansi, Chimwemwe Undi, joins me on the program to discuss it. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Now, the title is kind of a bit of a mix on one of the poems and a line in the poem, because it's an engineering marvel, I think, or an environmental marvel in the poem.
That's funny. The title comes from a building that is in downtown Winnipeg, a defunct beauty school called Scientific Marvel, and the title kind of existed before the book.
Oh, so
Because I think that phrase is so funny. But you're right that actually after I had the title, I think the word marvel came back into my writing vocabulary and showed up in that poem. So it sort of tied itself into a circle in that way.
I thought it was about the hydro building that you were referencing and kind of an adaptation of that phrase. So it came from a beauty school. What was it about that phrase or those two words that suggested themselves as the title?
Honestly, it started with just a thought that calling a beauty school scientific marvel was like very funny to me. That the suggestion that it would take both science and magic to make somebody beautiful, I thought was funny. But then kind of just the way that the words sounded together really struck me, and it's a title that stayed with me. And then, I think there's some back formation in that describing poetry as a scientific marvel as something that takes both the kind of precision you would expect from science and the kind of magic that is inherent in any art making, rang really true for me.
The fact that you found the place funny, or at least the name of the place funny, humor is pretty important. Even though a lot of these poems are serious, there is a lot of humor as well. How important is that tone in the poems? And like, do you think about kind of like not being too heavy-handed or serious all the time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll say my poetic practice started in kind of a spoken word world. And in that world, especially at the time that I was starting to write, there was a real feeling that in order for a poem to be good, it had to be serious and important, or at least I felt that way. And to be fair, I was writing about a lot of issues that I was kind of grappling with for the first time as an adult, like racial injustice and police violence and what it is to be a woman and an immigrant and a queer person. And so it was not always natural for me to have humor in my poems, but I love reading a poem that makes me laugh or smirk or moves me to something, beyond despair, something more joyful. And so I love hearing that people find the poems humorous, because obviously I think that I'm funny, but I like that as sort of a signal of some maturity in my work, is the ability to hold both the serious topics and the hard things and the laughter and the joy together.
So if you started from a serious place in a situation in which, the seriousness of things was kind of like the way that people performed it, how did you find the humor? How did you find yourself comfortable or like open enough to not just be serious?
I think when I really think about it, I think that it's more natural for there to be humor in things, because the world is a funny place. Like ridiculous and funny things are happening all the time. And if poetry, the practice of writing poetry, is a practice of noticing, which I think it is, then to really notice the world is to notice everything about the world, both the things that are hard and the things that are humorous. Yeah, I think that's my answer. I think the project of becoming a more mature and honest writer is necessarily the project of complicating the way that you talk about the world. And for me, the necessary complication was one that invited more humor into my writing.
When you say complicating things, like you kind of hint at that in a little bit in a couple of the poems in terms of, you know, speaking truth, but if I had to speak your truth, I'd have to lie about you. Things like that. Like, is that what you're meaning by complications?
It's part of what I mean, definitely. You know, I think it's a very naive idea that anything can be truly uncomplicated. And I try to be honest in my writing, and to write honestly. I think acknowledging that complication is important.
Can I talk about the intersection of law and poetry? Because you're a lawyer as well. And even in Property 101, which is the first poem in the collection, you know, you say, this is how I know how to do. This I know how to do. Reduce a person to their facts, unsympathetic to condition. The kind of black and white nature of the law. Like, are you wrestling with that because poetry is much more about nuance and less about those kind of black and whites?
Yeah, I do kind of wrestle with the difference in the ways that language is used in the law and in poetry. Not just literally in terms of the kind of language or the register of language that's used, but the purposes for which language is used. For me, poetry is really about revealing and unveiling truths about sort of infinitely approaching fundamental truths about things, or honesty about things, whereas the work of the law, and I say this as a person who, you know, the practice that I have is one that I'm very proud of, and I'm, you know, very fortunate to get to work for a lot of clients whose work I really believe in and think is important. But it's true that it's a work of persuasion, and sometimes persuasion does mean obscuring through language, making things read in a more favorable way in order to serve the purpose that you're serving. And, you know, it's a means to an end, the use of language on any side of any case. And I'm sort of fascinated with not just, you know, the use of language in poetry and the law, but in general, in journalism and in conversations between friends or lovers. And I think some of that is captured in that first poem, or at least I hope that it is.
Yeah, you write about the language that I serve and work against, and I was curious if you see either like poetry as the one that serves and law is the one that works against, or they each contain both of those things.
That's right. Yeah, I think they each contain both. I think there's a danger in the law and in poetry of using language for improper purposes. And that's, I mean, it's true in conversation. An improper purpose is an improper purpose. I always, you know, when I'm talking to people about language, talk about how the difference between a tool and a weapon can be just the intention of the person wielding the tool, right? So I think we all both work against language and serve language, and I'm interested in what that work means and why that work is necessary.
Yeah, you'd mentioned it interested in other facets like journalism. Byline Cento obviously speaks to that, right? That the writing about the passive voice, and I've been thinking about that particular in the coverage of Gaza. And it seems to me like I probably one of the first poems I've read where there's like 7 citations within a very short poem, but like from studies and from academic writing about this. But it seems to be around like violence, cops' violence against black people, if I'm reading into it right. Was this?
Yeah, I mean,
sorry,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, was there a specific inciting incident? I mean, obviously, there's been a ton of police violence. So I'm just curious if something sparked this in particular.
So my kind of educational background before I went to law school was in linguistics. And so when I say I'm interested in language, I mean, I really am very deeply interested in how language works. And the passive voice is, in and of itself, like anything in language, is a neutral thing. What I was interested in is the sort of neutrality of what the passive voice is, which is sort of just a syntactic reality, a way that a sentence works, and the tension between that and what the passive voice is used for, which is to, at least in journalism, is to obscure the subject of a sentence, the person who is acting, the person or the institution or the nation that is perpetuating the violence that is being spoken about. And that's certainly true in the coverage of what's happening in Palestine and in the coverage of policing and in all sorts of violences where it is beneficial to somebody. And I think it's worth asking who it's beneficial to obscure the reality of who has the power in that sentence, who is enacting the thing that is being enacted.
Did the study in linguistics make you a better poet? Like, did it prepare you for being a poet?
I was a poet before I was anything else. But I think, I think one of the things that I love about poetry is that every human experience that you have makes you a better poet, because the work of being a poet is the work of attending to the world. And so the more that you are in the world, the better your poetry gets. That's why I think most of my favorite poets are much older than me. They have more to say. They've seen more. I think in terms of my particular obsessions and interests, the formal study of the science of language through my degrees in linguistics gave me access to language and to understandings that I turn to a lot when I'm writing poems to kind of articulate what it is I am trying to say and trying to ask about, which is not just how language works, but why language works the way that it works.
Does understanding as a poet rob you of experiencing as a person? And by that I mean, like, if you have your antenna always up, as a poet observing things, are you truly in those things?
That's such a funny question. I think no, I don't think that it robs me of experience. And I think like the real thing I'll respond to in that question is that I don't believe that the work of being a poet is understanding. I think it's trying to understand. I think it's asking questions and remaining infinitely curious is fundamental to the work of being a poet. And so I think because I remain with my antenna up, I am more present in the world around me. I want to be as immersed in the world as possible and to, be there with the questions that I have, to use those experiences to form questions and to question those experiences. For me, it's not a sort of like academic external observation of the world in a glass. It's that I'm in the world and I'm affected by the world, and I want to wake up every day and ask questions about it.
So this isn't like a social science researcher who's trying to remain like objectively neutral in observation.
No, I don't believe neutrality exists, but I'm certainly not aiming for neutrality. Everything that I write, everything that I do is deeply informed by my own subjectivity, and I like it that way.
For sure. I want to talk about conversation, because obviously poetry, it's it's pretty solitary, writing alone generally, but your poems are in conversation with each other and with other poets' poems, and I'm curious how important that is to you. Is that like to push back against the possible isolation of writing poetry?
Not consciously. For I'll say, like, again, kind of going back to the origins of my poetic practice, my interest in being a poet. I started writing poetry as a high school student in a high school poetry club, and we gathered after school, 1 or 2 days a week, and we talked about poems and about each other's poems and other poems and dissected them and gave feedback. And so for me, the work of writing poetry has always been community oriented, and I think it enriches my poetry writing to be in community with other people. It's really important for me to be in community with other people, and that's both in my life, like being in workshop with other people and learning from other people, but also in the work in reading poems by other poets and by responding through my work or engaging through my work through the work of other poets. But yeah, I consider community to be deeply important to the work that I do.
Speaking of community, Winnipeg is a topic and a figure of recurrent repute within scientific marvel, including a very amusing initial poem that then kind of has echoes throughout the book. First off, like spacing out those Winnipeg poems, was that intentional to kind of like have these like ripples, or what was the thought behind that?
Oh, I like that description. Yeah, I there are sort of a few obvious and less obvious groups of poems in the book, and I know that when I read other collections, I really like being returned again and again to the same kind of idea or concept or structure. And so, I mean, the folks at Anansi were really instrumental, both my editor and their editorial staff were really instrumental in turning the package of poems into a coherent book. But that was something that we did turn our minds to, was spacing those poems out so that they could be experienced over a longer kind of span of time.
What all goes into like figuring out where each poem sits within a larger collection? Because I have to imagine there were maybe other poems that weren't included that were written in different periods, or like some of these aren't all from the same era, let's say. Like, how do you decide what goes together?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a formula, which was unfortunate for me because I really hoped that there would be, a spreadsheet or an engine or something that I could plug the poems into, and somebody could just tell me what the right poems were to include. It's at least on this book and working with Nancy was kind of a collaborative process. I had poems that I knew I really wanted in the collection. I had poems that I was not sure about. I got feedback from my editor, Kevin Connolly, and from other folks at Anansi. The poems in the book, I mean, it's kind of span about maybe longer than that, maybe 7 years of writing, but that's sort of a skewed timeline because I think the oldest poem in that book I wrote in about 2017, but the bulk of the poems were written in 2022 and 2023. And yeah, I mean, it's not a scientific it's not a scientific process.
That's the Marvel part.
Yeah, it's the Marvel part. Oh geez, yeah. I was trying not to be self-referential, but yeah, it's a bit of of both things. Like there's some considerations like what you mentioned of spreading out the poems that are similar thematically. There's a thought of what do I want to start out with and what do I want to end with. There's things, probably practical things about printing that I did not think or ask about, but it's I mean, there's people whose careers are dedicated to it, so it's a whole thing.
The court case poems, were they all written around the same time, or was this like an idea that you've kind of keep going back to, or like what was the genesis of that?
Yeah, so those erasures are, we'll just say that they are taken from the texts, which are Supreme Court of Canada decisions that I then redacted text from, and the poems that are left over, or the words that are left over, form the poems. And the Supreme Court of Canada cases are all cases in which the affected party, the affected individual, was a Black person, and where their Blackness was not sort of made express, was subtext in the poem, and the work of making the poems was turning that subtext into the text of the poem in some way. And the genesis of that is kind of twofold. Like I knew that I wanted to do something with that silence around Blackness in case law, and specifically Canadian case law, as early as sort of when I was starting law school. And the cases that I erase are all kind of foundational Supreme Court of Canada decisions that anybody in a Canadian common law program would be learning about in their first or second year of education. And I was struck, and by like a very few Black classmates were also really struck by how we would be talking about a case that was about stopping and frisking a Black person in downtown Toronto, and the person's Blackness would really not be critically engaged with either in the decision itself or in the discussion in the classroom. And so there was that idea with me. The idea of kind of working with the texts themselves was inspired by a professor that I had in law school, Dr. Amar Kode, who has a paper about one of the decisions that I erase, where he kind of does sort of the opposite of what I do, in that he expands the context of the decision by talking more about the circumstances of the person who's affected in the case, talking more about the history of what happened around the case, moving beyond the four corners of the decision, that are the things that don't kind of strictly fit within the legal context. Yeah, I don't know what else to say.
No, that's a lot to say. It does beg the question in terms of like, because there's a redaction to like the work you're doing, but when in stripping away things, you're getting at something that was maybe obfuscated or hidden.
Yeah.
And that like, is this like kind of like the marble slab and you're chipping away to find the statue underneath kind of work?
I think so. There is like a real, it's kind of a process of revelation. Like I start with the text and I start redacting and see what it reveals. And sometimes, you go back and say, it would be great if I could find a word to fill in this spot or whatever. But the word's already there, right? It's different from having a blank page that you're typing into. The words are already in the decision and they are what they are. And sort of trying to turn that into something meaningful is the project, and is the part that I really enjoyed.
Is the final poem Call In then in some ways like tied to those redactive poems about like, this can't be the work my freedom needs, the line about what is evoked, all of which would be denied? Like, is it in conversation with that, or is that because all of your poems are in conversation with one another?
That's a good question. I mean, I'd like to hear more about what you think about it. I know that's a very English professor answer.
Well, I guess because in part, you talk about like the Supreme Court decisions were trying to deny kind of any like racial bias, right? And I'm thinking back to those Toronto cases, that this was kind of like this notion of post-racial, that like, oh, we're not seeing race. This is just about, policing, but the biases were inherent or baked in. And there is even recent reference to post-racial in that call-in poem, right? Like drumming their hands on the post-racial steering wheel. That it seems to me to choose to end with this is maybe I've done this work, but I shouldn't have to do this work.
Well, I really like that reading. Yeah, I teach too many poetry workshops to commit to to a single interpretation of a poem or the placement in the book. But yeah, I think you're right that the poems all kind of mirror one another in various ways, and I think that's a well supported reading of that poem.
Is it daunting as a poet to release your poems into the world and let other people infer from them what they want?
It's more freeing than daunting, I think. I write the poems and I put them onto paper, and then the book kind of lives the life that it lives. I've had that experience a bit before in kind of publishing single poems in various journals, and less so in performing, just because of the kind of fleeting nature of a performance. People can't carry the poem with them after you perform it on a stage. But I find it personally really rewarding as a big reader of poetry, and somebody who really thrives in a room with other people talking about what a poem might be trying to do, and whether it does it. I'm really excited about even hearing you talk about your reading of Call In is sort of kind of the point of it for me. I like that it's in other people's hands and will have kind of a life that's beyond me.
Well, it is out now through Anansi. People can get it in their hands. Scientific marvel. Chimwemwe, thank you very much for taking some time to talk about the collection with me.
It was really my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Recording stopped.